Coming up, a presidential candidate has some bold new economic proposals. The clock is ticking on a new stimulus plan. Some thoughts on where we go from here, and much more as Labor This Week begins now. Hello, I'm Mark Harrison. Late last week, the presumptive Democratic candidate for president of the United States, Joe Biden, unveiled a sweeping $700 billion economic plan designed to shift away from globalization and free trade and toward protecting American workers and revitalizing struggling domestic industries. The Trump campaign, for its part, reacted with frustration, saying that Biden offered his plan before the president offered his Buy American proposal that has been held back for months because of internal White House bickering, including worry about China's reaction. In fact, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon said on his radio show that the White House had been caught flat-footed and that Biden has very smart people around him, particularly on the economic side. The Biden plan calls for federal government spending on $400 billion over a 4-year period on materials and services made in the United States, $300 billion on U.S.-based research and development on electric cars, artificial intelligence, and similar technologies, and undertaking a 100-day supply chain review that could require federal agencies to buy only medical supplies and other goods manufactured in the U.S., and urged an end to loopholes that allow procurement officers and federal contractors to skirt around existing Buy America clauses in the regulations. The former vice president said his plan would restore jobs lost this year and create 5 million new ones. And he stressed the need to protect workers and Main Street rather than wealthy investors and the class of bankers and CEOs that are currently protected. We'll be right back with a look at what Washington is planning to do about the soon-to-expire economic stimulus plan. With the clock ticking on the $600 a week stimulus set to expire at the end of this month and nearly half the American population out of work, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell warned lawmakers that the post-pandemic economy could worsen inequality and widen the gap for already disadvantaged workers. There does, however, seem to be some light at the end of the tunnel, with Senator Mitch McConnell saying the country needs one last boost. But some Republican senators are nervous about increasing spending so close to the election. So far, the White House, at least, has voiced support for another round of stimulus checks, but as of yet has offered no real tangible plan. Chairman Powell, who is in favor of new legislation, suggested that lawmakers should consider direct support to help service workers that have been displaced and are struggling to return to work. McConnell has indicated that part of the stimulus could go to help many of those hardest hit who work in the hospitality industry and earn $40,000 a year or less. Now, with time running out and the need for assistance growing more urgent by the day, former Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, along with a group of economists, recently proposed a funding plan to Congress that calls for a renewal of expanded unemployment benefits and the creation of a temporary new pandemic earned income tax credit to supplement the salaries of those who return to work. Support would continue for the hardest hit businesses and send at least $500 billion to state and local governments. Now, that aid would support public education and other services, with states being restricted from using the money to address pre-existing pension shortfalls or to finance any new tax cuts. Yet the question still remains, how much is enough? You may recall that Democrats in the House passed a $3 trillion bill in May that included a second round of $1,200 stimulus checks for individuals, with the GOP-controlled Senate arguing that those payments don't directly stimulate the economy. Now, according to Chairman Powell, a full economic recovery is unlikely until the disease has been contained. I'll be right back with some of the other headlines making news. Roughly one-third of American households have been unable to make on-time housing payments so far in the month of July, and this number includes both renters who pay monthly rent and homeowners who pay a monthly mortgage. with 19% making absolutely no payments and 13% making partial payments. The federal eviction moratorium that prohibits mortgage holders backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac being removed from their homes for non-payment will end on August 31st. Staying with housing for the moment, while homeowners have some relief in place at least until the end of summer, those who rent have not been so lucky and are often members of a working class that has little or no ability to save for the huge down payments and closing costs now required to own a home. The backlog of eviction cases now pending across the country are beginning to move through the nation's court systems and many now face the prospect of being removed from their homes. The $1,200 stimulus checks have long been exhausted, and with the $600 a week enhanced unemployment benefit set to expire shortly, many fear the worst. The poor and the elderly are the most worried, with Peter Hepburn of Princeton University saying, if you look at the COVID pandemic, the health outcomes and the economic outcomes are hitting the black and brown communities very hard. It seems pay cuts are now becoming a defining feature of the coronavirus recession. Many employers are cutting back their workers' hours with forced days off without pay. Salaried employees and white-collar workers have begun to feel the cuts, which are now spreading rapidly across most sectors. A fact which could indicate a deep recession and a slow recovery, since this class of workers is usually the last to feel financial pain during a turndown. At least 4 million private sector workers have had their pay cut since the pandemic began. Another troubling sign that the economy may be in for a long slog back to normalcy is that the rich among us have begun to trim their spending. Economists now estimate that the top highest earning quarter of Americans have been responsible for half of the decline in consumption during this recession. It seems that as income inequality has increased, so has what's being called consumption inequality increased. This means that more and more of us are dependent on the whims of the highest earners to spend on things that require the rest of us to provide services for them. And when they stop spending on dinners out and services to renovate their homes, etc., we stop getting paid. I'll be right back in a moment with my thoughts on the dire choice that this country now faces. "1984, The Water Thief, The Hunger Games, all past popular novels set in the not-so-distant future from the time of their writing, when the human race has fallen into complete dystopian societal breakdown." What is dystopian exactly? Well, the term utopian describes a society that's conceived to be perfect. Dystopian, however, is the exact opposite. It describes an imaginary society that is dehumanizing and as unpleasant as possible. It is a no-kidding setting where a few at the top have amazing wealth and live in splendor, while the rest of society lives in walled-off communities filled with crime and sickness, where only the luckiest get to emerge and occasionally service those living in that splendor. It is a society where the few dictate the rules to the many, and where the many fight for the scraps that remain. Food is scant, healthcare is non-existent, housing barely inhabitable. The few hate the many, and they want them out of sight and out of mind unless they need something cleaned. There have been several events in our lifetimes that have led to a weakening of the working class in America. The weakening of unions and a justice system that has turned against them with almost every ruling since the mid-1960s. The recession caused by the fuel shortages of the 1970s. The power shift toward the wealthy that saw massive corporate takeovers that used overly funded worker pensions to leverage those hostile buyouts, and the eventual eradication of pensions as part of the compensation package for most corporate employees, and the shift to 401ks that fueled the ongoing rise of the stock markets in the 1980s. The 2001 9/11 attacks, and the financial meltdown of the 2000s. In all of these instances, the middle and working classes fell farther and farther behind in their ability to earn and save and spend. The four biggest drains on our society at large are poverty, healthcare inequality, wealth inequality, and wage stagnation. Indeed, take a drive to certain parts of our inner cities and our most rural and poor communities, and you will see dystopian sub-societies already in existence, where healthcare long ago left, law enforcement no longer ventures, and where whole families have been destroyed by complete and utter lack, and by drug and alcohol-fueled deaths of despair that most of us could never imagine. Yet with each passing event I just described, more and more of us have joined these shadow societies. And now as we face the single biggest health and wealth crisis we will ever know in our lives, from the coronavirus pandemic and its ensuing economic meltdown, our leaders flounder. The elected powers that be in our nation's capital have taken to hiding behind the politics of division, claiming the other side is always to blame. And while we watch our nation burn, our wealthy classes run from the possibility of illness to their private country sanctuaries. The rest are left behind to once again add to the dystopian underclasses that steadily grow among us. We face a dire decision as a nation and possibly a world. This time must be different. This time, if we don't stop the trends of the last 50 years, our stories will no longer be the subject of fictional dystopian novels. Rather, our stories will be the facts that future generations read about in dystopian history books. There is an election in November. Which will you be reading in the years to come? I'm Mark Harrison for Labor This Week, and I'll see you next week.